My name is Colonel Penelope Ward. I'm a military physician, 20 years of service, 17 of them in active deployment, 10 of those directly on the front lines. I've sutured wounds during sandstorms, brought children into the world inside tents while shells detonated nearby, and treated trauma so severe it lingered beneath my fingernails for weeks. I never chased after medals. What I cared about was the breath that followed resuscitation. That instant when a soldier opens their eyes and understands they're still alive. But nothing in my training equipped me for the degradation I encountered in a ballroom crowded with brass and pedigree. The gala was hosted in Fort Lunsford's Grand Hall. Gleaming marble floors, golden banners, string instruments playing chamber music as though none of us had ever crawled through dust and death. It was the sort of evening where you either wore your uniform like a fortress or a disguise. I wore mine with dignity. The medals fastened to my chest weren't decorative. They existed for Staff Sergeant Mendes, who bled to death in my arms, for Specialist Avery, who caught shrapnel in the eye and still found the courage to phone her mother. I hadn't come to be noticed. I came because command had invited me. I hadn't anticipated seeing my family there. I spotted them near the central arch, my mother straightening her pearl necklace, my sister Olivia with her carefully styled curls, and Carson, my older brother, former intelligence officer, now a civilian defense consultant, still carrying himself as though the Army owed him a debt. I approached quietly and gave a nod. Before I could get a word out, Carson turned and assessed me. His lip curled with something between smugness and contempt. Then he said it, "Stop acting like a nurse, Penny. This isn't your ER." The word struck harder than any mortar round. I looked at him, at his press suit, at the martini in his grip, at that smile, the one that always communicated, "You don't belong here." He said it with just enough volume for the couple standing nearby to catch it, and just quiet enough to ensure I'd be the one who appeared dramatic if I responded. I didn't flinch. I'd faced gunfire with far better aim. Behind him, I noticed someone else, a young man in a dark suit, seated near the corner. His wheelchair was nearly camouflaged against the black and silver decor. His complexion was pallid, his gaze hollow. He wasn't engaged in any conversation. No one was engaging with him. I recognized him. Lieutenant Nathan Beckett, combat engineer, gravely wounded by an IED in Syria, son of General Harlan Beckett, 4-star. I knew his file, but more than that, I knew that expression. It was the look of a soldier who had returned home but left himself behind. I turned away from Carson without uttering a word. I crossed the room in full view of the gathering. Some conversations halted. A few people stared. I knelt beside Nathan. He startled, not violently, just enough to reveal he was no longer accustomed to kindness. I asked gently, "Would you like a dance?" He blinked. I waited. He didn't respond at first. His hand twitched faintly in his lap, as though the memory of movement still lived within his nerves. A slow, weighted silence formed around us, denser than the music. Then he nodded. No one helped him. I didn't lift him. I simply rose and extended my hand. He gripped the side of his chair and pressed forward. The effort was unsteady. His leg brace slipped slightly as he leaned ahead. He grunted. I waited, and then he rose. Not fully, but sufficiently. He placed one foot carefully before the other. His hand found mine, not for balance, but for presence. I didn't steer him. We moved slowly. One shuffle, a breath, another shuffle. My uniform boots echoed alongside his mechanical step. The orchestra didn't alter its tempo, but the room did. People took notice. A woman gasped. The entire ballroom had fallen into stillness. Carson stared, his glass suspended in midair. My mother shifted slightly backward, her eyes searching for someone who could explain what was unfolding. My sister looked drained of color. The string quartet continued, a haunting melody, the violin swelling beneath the weight of something no one had prepared for. Nathan's grip tightened on my hand, not in fear, but in determination. His brow furrowed. He looked upward, not at me, but beyond me. Then, slowly, he began to rotate, barely a quarter turn, off balance. But it was his choice to move, his choice to take the next step, and I followed. We didn't complete a waltz, but we completed something else. Nathan exhaled deeply, nodded once, and lowered himself back into his chair. His eyes, once vacant, now shimmered with something dangerously close to hope. I straightened my uniform and adjusted my collar. The silence held. Then came footsteps, measured and heavy. General Harlan Beckett crossed the floor like a man navigating the space between military protocol and personal grief. His chest was covered in stars, but his eyes were filled with water. He stopped before us. The room held its breath. He looked at his son, then at me, and then, with a voice fracturing beneath generations of discipline, he said, "Colonel, you just saved my son's life." I didn't smile. I simply nodded. Behind me, my family stood frozen, silent. For the first time, Carson had nothing to say. The ride home was quiet, but not the good kind. The kind that simmers just beneath boiling, ready to overflow. The kind that makes the air inside a luxury SUV feel like a pressure chamber. I sat behind the driver, watching my reflection in the tinted window. The metal bars on my chest caught faint glints from the city lights drifting past. I didn't straighten them. I let them sit off-center. The silence fractured the moment the driver shut the door. My mother spoke first. "Well, that was inappropriate," she said, smoothing the silk scarf at her neck as though it had been ruffled by shame itself. I didn't respond. I kept my gaze on the window. She leaned forward slightly, her voice sharpening. "You couldn't have simply sat and clapped politely. Did you truly need to turn that poor wounded boy into a spectacle?" I turned my head just slightly, enough for her to catch my profile, not enough to offer anything she could interpret. "Do you think General Beckett invited you to show off? You embarrassed him. You embarrassed us." I didn't blink. The car eased to a red light. Outside, a group of young cadets laughed near a bus stop, dressed in civilian clothes, moving with effortless ease. They looked weightless. Then came Carson. He didn't raise his voice. He never needed to. His tone was clipped, cold as always. "You planned that, didn't you? You read his file. You wanted to make a move in front of a 4-star. My stomach tightened, not from shock, but from the familiarity of it. Carson had always believed ambition was somehow dirtier when it came from someone like me. He could climb ladders. I was supposed to polish the floors beneath them. I still said nothing. He pressed on. "You choreographed the whole thing. That wasn't medicine. That was theater. You've always wanted to be the exception, the story, the hero. The Army doesn't need medics who perform. It needs soldiers who follow orders." That final word landed hard. Follow. It carried me back to a day at a forward operating base in Kandahar, 6 years prior. Word reached us that a village child had stepped on something near the wire, likely an old mine. I was the closest. I ran. When I reached him, he was still breathing, his legs destroyed, crying in Pashto for his mother. I began the tourniquets. I radioed for evac. Then command called me back. "Stand down, Colonel. He's not our mission. Not our mission." The boy bled out in my arms before I could make it back across the line. I wrote his name in my journal that night. I didn't know how to spell it. I simply drew the shape of his face. I had followed orders. He had died. Tonight, I hadn't followed. I had let someone lead. Back in the car, Carson's voice cut through again. "I spoke with your CO 2 weeks ago. Word is they're reviewing your post-field eligibility. Some believe you're no longer suited for high-visibility operations. You're a liability." I finally turned toward him, slowly. "I didn't realize you were still keeping tabs on me." He blinked. That caught him off guard. Not because it was untrue, but because it wasn't angry. He scoffed and redirected his gaze out his own window. Mom interjected. "We're not trying to tear you down, Penelope. We just don't want you drawing the wrong kind of attention." I smiled faintly at the glass. The wrong kind. That's what they had called it when I applied to Ranger School. When I declined Carson's offer to work in private defense. When I remained enlisted instead of going civilian for better pay. "I didn't do it for attention," I said quietly. "Then why?" Carson snapped. I could have said it was because Nathan's eyes reminded me of that boy in the dirt. I could have said I didn't want another name I couldn't spell carved into my memory. But I didn't. Instead, I said, because I was there. I saw him, and no one else did. Carson scoffed again. "You keep thinking you're different. That makes you dangerous." "Dangerous?" I turned back to the window. This time, My reflection held my gaze directly. I recalled the moment Nathan stood, his trembling hand in mine, the scrape of his brace against the floor, the hush of the room, as though everyone's breath had been drawn into a single instant. That wasn't theater. That was life. Do you know what the general said to me? I asked. Neither of them responded. He said, "Colonel, you just saved my son's life." Silence again, but this time it belonged to me. After arriving home that night, I didn't bother changing out of my dress uniform. I unpinned the medals and arranged them carefully on my desk. Then I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the floor, the faint hum of the heater droning like a distant wasp. I wasn't thinking about the Gala anymore. I was back there again. Forward operating Base Mitchell, southern Afghanistan. Dry heat, red dust coating your lungs. That place still lived in the corners of my body, folded into old scar tissue and lodged behind my left shoulder where the shrapnel had entered. It was late afternoon. The light was brutal. I remember the sandbags stacked around the medical tent like hollow guarantees. I had just finished redressing Sergeant Mullen's chest wound when the first round struck. A mortar perhaps 70 meters out. The next landed closer. We already had 4 casualties inside the tent. 1 unconscious, 1 intubated. 2 corpsmen were shouting for me. Morphine was running low. The generator for the air conditioning had failed earlier that morning. The third explosion brought down part of the north fence. That's when I heard it. A scream. Not loud, but distinct. Raw, desperate. It came from somewhere outside the tent, near the triage zone. I stepped out and saw him. A young private, bleeding from the abdomen, pinned beneath a section of collapsed structure. There was no one else outside. Protocol required staying undercover. Reinforcements were already en route, a matter of minutes. But I moved anyway. I sprinted low, kept my head down, could feel each detonation vibrating through the soles of my boots. I reached him and dropped to my knees, hands instinctively checking for pulse, breathing, responsiveness. His name was Lindley. He was 19. He kept repeating, "Please don't leave me." I hadn't planned to. I wedged my shoulder beneath the debris, braced myself, and pushed. My legs screamed. I'd torn something, but I kept pushing until it shifted far enough to drag him clear. We were halfway back to the tent when it happened. Another blast. Everything turned white, then red. I regained consciousness 6 hours later in the surgical bay of a mobile hospital. My leg was splinted. I had a grade 3 concussion and 3 fractured ribs. Mullins had survived. So had Lindley. I, however, had not, at least not in the way I once existed. For 6 weeks, I lay on a recovery cot. No visitors, just check-ins and charts. Most of my team had rotated out. I heard from a few nurses, a chaplain. Lindley even sent me a note that read, "You gave me another birthday." But Carson, he sent an email. "No call, no visit, just a message. Don't blow this up. You got hurt doing something reckless. That doesn't make you a hero. It makes you stupid. Stay quiet. Let it pass." I remember staring at that screen for a long time. Then I deleted it. I told myself it was just Carson being Carson. Tough love, misguided protection. But I knew better. His contempt for me hadn't begun with that email. It had simply learned to speak louder, and I had learned to grow quieter. After my discharge, I didn't go home. I stayed on base, filed the after-action reports, completed the psychological evaluations, passed the physical recall 6 weeks ahead of schedule. No one said much, except for one lieutenant colonel who told me, "You're not built like most." He meant it as a compliment. I carried it like a warning. For a while, I tried to convince myself it wasn't personal. That Carson's detachment was his way of coping. That being the older brother had hardened him. That perhaps he felt diminished by me. But deep down, I understood. His contempt wasn't accidental. It wasn't emotional distance or wounded pride. It was structural. He didn't believe I belonged. Not in the field, not in the uniform, not at the table. He considered me a story that got lucky, a medic who stumbled her way into a handful of medals and a position she hadn't earned. He would insist it wasn't about gender, yet every sentence he spoke was saturated with it. He called me reckless. He said I sought attention. He claimed I didn't understand real war, and I allowed him to say it for years. But that ended tonight because when I reached out to Nathan Beckett, I didn't perform. I didn't disobey. I didn't grandstand. I saw someone no one else was seeing. And for once, someone saw me too. Those 7 words from General Beckett weren't flattery. They were recognition. For the first time in a long while, someone of that rank looked at me and didn't see a nurse who had wandered onto a battlefield. They saw a colonel who had earned every single step. 3 days after the gala, a plain white envelope arrived at my quarters. No markings, no insignia, just my name in block letters. I opened it carefully, not wanting to crease it. Inside was a folded note, typed and signed to the bottom. Colonel Ward, I would be honored if you joined us at Walter Reed next Friday to speak with a group of young officers currently undergoing rehabilitation. Your presence and your example made a difference. General Harlan Beckett. I read those words 3 times. The invitation wasn't a command. It hadn't been routed through a superior officer or wrapped in military formality. It was personal, genuine. For a long moment, I didn't move. My fingers stayed wrapped around the envelope as though it might vanish if I looked away. Then I folded it, placed it inside the back cover of my field notebook, and exhaled. The following day, I received a phone call. Not from my commanding officer. Not from anyone at Walter Reed. It was from Carson. He didn't even bother with a greeting. "What the hell are you doing, Penny?" I said nothing. I let him speak. "I heard you're planning to go to Walter Reed to give a speech. To stand up there like some decorated war hero pretending you're the model officer." Still, I remained silent. He continued. "Do you even realize how damaging that is? You're not just putting yourself in the spotlight. You're dragging the family name into it. We're under review for 2 defense contracts. You think it helps that my sister is out there playing savior for a general's disabled son?" I felt the muscles in my jaw tighten, but I held steady. "Carson," I said slowly, "I didn't do anything for the cameras." He laughed, short, bitter. "No, but the cameras followed anyway. And now everyone's calling you the miracle medic, the Beckett Whisperer. You really think that's going unnoticed?" That's when I understood. It wasn't about me being dangerous. It was about me being visible. Carson had always preferred me invisible, useful in private, dismissible in public. "I'm going," I said calmly. He snapped. "Well, don't be surprised when things start falling apart for you, Colonel." Then he hung up. That night, I received a message from my CO. It wasn't accusatory, but it was measured. "Ward, heads up. There's been some chatter. Someone flagged a few lines from your Kandahar report. Language suggesting you disobeyed a directive. Not formal, just internal circulation. Be smart." I didn't need to ask where it had originated. I already knew. The next morning, 2 separate news outlets published articles online. Low-tier, clickbait headlines, vague insinuations. Field medic or liability. Colonel's heroism questioned after Gala spotlight. Controversy behind the uniform. The real story of Penelope Ward. They cited anonymous sources, stripped old mission reports of their context, and quoted an unnamed former soldier who alleged I had once jeopardized a unit by acting without authorization. There was no proof, but there didn't need to be. That was the strategy. Carson knew the system. He didn't need to get me formally reprimanded. He only needed to muddy the waters enough that I couldn't stand tall in them. He wanted to drown me in suggestion. A few years ago, it might have worked, but not anymore. I wasn't going to shrink. Not after everything I'd climbed through. Not after watching Nathan Beckett rise to his feet in front of hundreds of strangers just to take a single step. I knew what I had done. I knew what I hadn't. And I knew what silence cost. That afternoon, I emailed General Beckett. "Sir, I accept your invitation. I will be honored to meet your officers. Colonel P. Ward." I didn't copy my CO. I didn't notify public affairs. I packed my bag quietly, printed my deployment files, and requested 2 days of personal leave. Then I called a friend from the legal office. "Do me a favor," I said. "Check who accessed my personnel file this week." A pause, then, "Already know, don't you?" I nodded, even though she couldn't see it. "Yes," I said, "but I need proof." I've learned over the years that truth doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it leaves a digital trail. It took fewer than 36 hours to confirm what I had already suspected. Carson hadn't merely made a phone call or circulated a few half-truths. He had been operating behind the scenes for months, aligning himself with a coalition of defense contractors and conservative policymakers, quietly lobbying against the full integration of military medical personnel in frontline operations. Their argument: that medics, particularly female officers in combat-adjacent roles, undermined unit cohesion and blurred operational clarity. I had noticed fragments of it before: op-eds with coded language, congressional hearings framing concerns about deployment boundaries. But I hadn't realized how close it had reached until I saw my name in one of their internal memos. It wasn't public, not yet, but a contact in Defense Affairs, someone I had once trained in field trauma care, flagged it quietly. The memo listed 3 names: Colonel P. Ward, Lieutenant T. Sims, Major R. Levy. All 3 of us were military medics. All 3 had received valor decorations within the past decade. All 3 had appeared briefly in Department of Defense outreach materials promoting advanced combat medicine. According to the memo, we were cases of inflated field presence and examples of operational risk introduced by cross-functional ambiguity. I read that sentence 5 times. Cross-functional ambiguity. That was the phrase they used for saving lives under fire. My hands didn't tremble. I had seen worse, heard worse, but something beneath my ribs pulled tight. Not fear, not even anger. Something colder. Carson wasn't simply trying to silence me. He was helping construct a narrative to erase people like me entirely. I needed evidence, not emotion. So I began documenting, quietly, methodically. I tracked financial disclosures, followed threads between think tanks and contractors, noted article timing and keyword patterns. I gathered statements from public forums, reviewed on-the-record comments by individuals tied to Carson's consulting firm. All of this without leaking, without venting, without allowing anyone to see me waver. I didn't need headlines. I needed the truth to accumulate neatly and irrefutably. What I hadn't expected was the email. It arrived through a secure server. No name, no greeting, just a single line. He did the same to me, and worse. Attached was a scanned PDF, divorce filings, settlement documents, non-disclosure clauses. At first I assumed it was spam until I recognized the name. Mira Staunton Vaught, Carson's ex-wife. I hadn't heard her name in years. They had separated 5 years earlier, quietly, without scandal. The family had dismissed it, called it amicable. But Mira had vanished afterward, left D.C., took a position in nonprofit health, and never attended another family gathering. I opened the file. It contained spreadsheets documenting financial control, how Carson had restricted her access to joint accounts, monitored her spending, and even manipulated her medical insurance coverage during the divorce proceedings. There are emails as well, in which he threatened to professionally destroy her if she spoke publicly about the marriage. And buried in the middle was a brief forwarded thread, a message Carson had sent to a colleague 3 months prior. If we can discredit Penelope at the symposium, we'll have enough momentum to shut down the pilot program at Walter Reed. Too much noise around female combat medics lately. She's the symbol. Take her down. The narrative dies. I stared at the screen for a long time. Not because I was surprised, but because I finally had what I needed. Not rumor, not suspicion. Proof. Still, something didn't sit right. I replied, "Why now?" The response came quickly. "Because I watched your speech at the gala. And because you didn't flinch." She signed it this time. Mira, it wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't solidarity. But it was enough. Enough to know I wasn't the only one who had been dismissed, undermined, treated as disposable by a man who wore power like armor. I compiled the files, redacted what required redacting, verified sources. Then I made one final complete copy of the full report and delivered it in person to the office of the Inspector General. No press, no spectacle, just the truth. Then I drove to Walter Reed, folded the General's letter into my coat pocket, and walked through the main entrance without looking back. Walter Reed didn't feel like a hospital, not in the conventional sense. It breathed like a battlefield, quiet but watchful, populated by people who had glimpsed the outermost edge of existence and were still learning how to return from it. The walls carried a faint scent of antiseptic and stubbornness, the kind that refuses to be dismissed. The rehabilitation wing was bright, bathed in natural light, with softly colored walls. But the most striking element was the sound, or the absence of it. No one wept, no one cried out, yet effort filled the air. Every breath, every stretch, every clenched jaw said, "We're still here." Nathan spotted me first. He was across the room, balancing between parallel bars. His uniform had been replaced by standard rehab attire, a loose shirt, fitted brace, soft-soled shoes. His father stood at a respectful distance, arms folded, not interfering. Nathan's eyes found mine. He didn't smile, not yet, but he nodded. That was sufficient. I joined a physical therapy team at the edge of the mats. I wasn't wearing my uniform, just a plain navy shirt and slacks. No rank, no insignia, just the memory of who I had been when this work began and the commitment of who I would be returning to it. I didn't issue orders. I didn't demonstrate anything. I sat with a small group, officers, specialists, enlisted personnel, men and women, some missing limbs, others struggling to use the ones they still had. Each carried more than physical pain. You could see it in their posture, in the way they hesitated before moving, as though their bodies were seeking permission from something their minds couldn't name. I didn't interrupt that silence. Instead, I told them a story. Not about war, not about medals, about a child I had once treated. Burns across half his face, too frightened to look in a mirror. He refused to walk, not because he was unable to, but because he was convinced that anyone who saw him would turn away. So every day I walked beside him, not in front, not behind, beside, until one morning he released my sleeve. I ended the story there. No dramatic conclusion, just the truth. Nathan was listening. He was no longer seated. He had taken 2 steps since I arrived, unsteady but forward. By the 3rd step, his arms trembled. I moved closer, not to hold him, only to ensure he knew I saw him. He gritted his teeth. Sweat gathered along his hairline. Another step. He looked at me, then at the floor. His voice was barely above a whisper. "This one hurts." I nodded. "Then it's working." He blinked, then took another step and another. The room grew still, not in awe but in respect. Pain is ordinary in this place. Progress is sacred. Nathan reached the end of the bars and turned slowly. His father didn't move. I said nothing. I simply gave him the space to feel what needed to be felt. Then someone behind me spoke. It was a young lieutenant I hadn't yet met. Perhaps 24 years old, short-cropped hair, her left hand absent. She leaned against the door frame, arms folded, watching. "She doesn't guide," the lieutenant said, almost to herself. "She follows. But that's what makes us move." Silence settled for a beat. Then Nathan, breathless, said, "I didn't think I could do that." I replied, "That's because you were taught to wait for someone to tell you when it was time." He looked at his own feet as though they belonged to someone else, then back at me. "I don't want to wait anymore." "Then don't," I said. "Just make sure the next step is yours." The rest of the day moved in a blur. More therapy, more notes, brief meetings with staff. I signed a few forms, agreed to consult on a new program. But my mind stayed with that sentence. She doesn't guide, she follows. It wasn't meant as conventional praise, but it was the highest recognition I could have received. Because in a world constructed on hierarchy and authority, sometimes the most radical act is choosing to walk beside someone. Not to lead, not to repair, but to believe and let belief do the rest. The hardest part of filing a report isn't gathering the evidence. It isn't writing the summary or organizing the timeline. It's pressing send, knowing that what happens next is no longer within your control. I submitted the full report on Carson to the Department of Defense Inspector General on a Thursday morning. No ceremony, no press leak, no dramatic confrontation. Just an encrypted email with attachments and a single sentence in the body. Submitted in accordance with Title 10, U.S. Code Section 1034, Military Whistleblower Protection Act. Penelope Ward. By noon the following day, they had confirmed receipt and expressed gratitude for my role in upholding the integrity of institutional conduct. By Monday, Carson had been suspended pending investigation. It wasn't public yet, but I knew because that afternoon my phone rang. Not a military line, not an unknown number. My mother. She didn't wait for me to speak. "What the hell did you do?" Her voice was brittle and cold. the kind of cold that only sounds composed to those who've never been near real heat. Carson just called. They removed him from his position. No notice, no explanation. Do you understand what this does to his career? To our name? I drew a slow breath, staring out the window of my temporary quarters at Walter Reed. Mom, I said calmly, I submitted evidence. I didn't fabricate it. You humiliated this family, she hissed. You dragged your own brother through the mud for what? Some spotlight at a gala. I almost laughed, not because it was amusing, but because she still believed this was about a dance. You think I did this to embarrass him? I asked. You think I wanted this? A pause, brief. You've always resented him, she said. Ever since childhood. You could never tolerate not being the favorite. I let that settle. Then I said the only thing I could. Mom, I'm not angry. I'm not even hurt. Then what are you? I'm tired, I said. Tired of pretending that silence is the same as peace. Another pause. Then she said it. You're just like your father. And hung up. I didn't call back. I didn't need to. I closed my phone, set it down gently, and went to the file cabinet beside my bed. I removed a folded piece of paper, a letter written by my father 15 years ago, just before his deployment to Romani. He never came home. The letter contained nothing heroic. No dramatic farewell. Just one line that had stayed with me. The only thing more dangerous than doing what's right is deciding to stay quiet when you know what's wrong. That evening, the Office of the Inspector General released an internal bulletin. Carson's access to DoD systems had been revoked. He was no longer permitted to serve in an advisory capacity until the full review concluded. It would take weeks, months perhaps, but the process had begun. I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat. I returned to the rehab wing the next morning. Nathan was already there, walking laps with another patient. He waved when he saw me. I nodded. The young lieutenant, Alexis, I had learned her name was, greeted me with a smile. He's getting faster, she said. I looked over at Nathan. He's not just moving, I replied. He's choosing. She tilted her head. How did you get him to start? I didn't, I said. He led. I followed. She grinned. That's your thing, isn't it? I smiled back. It works. Later that afternoon, the general found me in the hallway. He didn't mention Carson. He didn't ask about the investigation. He simply said, "You stood still in a room full of pressure. That's a rare thing." I shrugged. I just made space. He nodded thoughtfully. As I turned to leave, Alexis's voice drifted softly from behind me. She doesn't guide. She follows. But that's what makes us move. I said nothing. I didn't need to. That line would remain with me longer than most medals, because in the end, leadership isn't about volume. It's about presence. And I was finally finished being silent. The room wasn't as large as I'd expected for a meeting called under routine protocol review at the Pentagon. It felt unexpectedly intimate. A round table of senior officers, several department representatives, and a glass wall overlooking the river. No cameras, no microphones. But I knew better. Nothing here was ever merely routine. I sat near the far end in civilian clothing, beside a legal liaison. I hadn't been invited to speak, only to attend. Observe. Across from me sat Carson. His suit was pristine, his posture composed, but his eyes flickered when they caught mine, just for a second. Then he looked away, as though I were an inconvenient imperfection on a carefully arranged day. He hadn't expected me to be there. Good. The chair of the review committee, a two-star with a composed manner and precise delivery, opened the session by addressing procedural matters. I barely followed. My attention was on the folder in his hands, the one with my name on the tab. Eventually, the words arrived. As requested by General Harlan Beckett, we have reopened the inquiry into the Ward Lima Forward Operating Report dated June 14, 2017. Carson flinched. So was real. General Beckett hadn't just offered gratitude in words. He had gone to the department and formally requested that my combat record be thoroughly reviewed and properly credited. The same report Carson and his allies had attempted to use as a weapon against me. The same one I had stopped defending years ago because contesting men who had already decided I didn't belong seemed pointless. The chair continued. Today we'll hear from one individual who was present at Forward Operating Post Lima during the incident in question. Carson leaned forward, not visibly anxious but attentive. The door opened. A woman entered, early 40s, solid build, wearing a VA badge. Her short hair was streaked with gray. Her stride was marked by a faint limp. My breath caught. It was Lieutenant Commander Dana Kelso. I hadn't seen her in 6 years. She had been our surgical lead on the ground, brilliant under pressure, the kind of person who didn't request permission to save lives. She simply did it and addressed the politics afterward. She took the seat across from me, facing the board. Her voice was level. I served with Colonel Ward at FOB Lima. During the June 14th attack, our unit was cut off for more than 8 hours. We had no communications, no reinforcements, no evacuation window. She looked straight ahead. During that time, Colonel Ward assumed command of the triage center. She stabilized 9 critical injuries, including 2 abdominal bleeds, a partial amputation, and a collapsed lung. No one died under her care that night. No one spoke. Dana's voice didn't waver. There was a moment around hour 6 when the secondary wall was breached. We were overrun. Ward dragged one of the wounded, still on oxygen, back behind the inner defense line while absorbing shrapnel in her own leg. She refused morphine until every other patient was stable. Carson shifted in his chair. Dana glanced at him, then returned her gaze to the board. I've read the redacted report. I've seen what's been circulated regarding her judgment that night. I'm here to say, without her actions, we would have lost at least half the wounded, including me. The chair nodded slowly. Why was your statement not included in the initial report? Dana didn't pause. I was medevaced the following morning and placed in isolation due to infection risk. I submitted my account, but it was delayed in the chain of command. By the time it surfaced, the investigation had already closed. She added, I didn't know until recently that there was even a question about her performance. The room went still. Then, for the first time, General Beckett, who had remained silent until that moment, spoke. He turned to the board. I requested this review, not because Colonel Ward asked me to. She didn't. He turned toward Carson. I requested it after watching my son, who hadn't stood unassisted in 14 months, walk 6 full steps under her watch. No pity, no stage, just respect. Carson's jaw tightened. Beckett leaned forward. If this institution penalizes integrity because it makes certain people uncomfortable, then we are not protecting the uniform. We are burying it. He settled back. Silence again. But this time it belonged to me. By the time I left the Pentagon that afternoon, the press had already caught wind of it. Not the full account, not the nuance, just enough to disturb the surface. A headline appeared on a mid-tier defense blog by nightfall. Colonel who danced at Gala now central to Pentagon firestorm. Then another, decorated medic or reckless officer. Internal review sparks political fallout. By the following morning, it had reached major outlets. I woke to 7 missed calls, 3 voicemails, and dozens of emails from reporters seeking quotes, clarifications, reactions. They wanted a face. I gave them none. I didn't schedule interviews. I didn't hold a press conference. I didn't appear on programs. Instead, I wrote a letter by hand. It was scanned and transmitted through the appropriate military channels, then made available to all registered media upon request, per regulation. It read, To whom it may concern, I am not a hero. I'm not a victim. I am a soldier who made a choice in a moment that mattered. I didn't act for medals. I didn't act for headlines. I acted because someone needed help and I was there. That is the job. There are those who believe that keeping your head down is the surest path to survival in this system. I disagree. Doing what is right is not always convenient. It rarely comes with applause. But silence, in the face of harm, is complicity. I have lived long enough in its shadow. I do not regret speaking. I only regret that it took this long to be heard. Colonel Penelope Ward, Army Medical Corps. That was all I said, but it was sufficient. The following day, the story shifted, not toward scandal, but toward accountability. Internal audits were initiated. Contracts tied to Carson's firm were frozen pending investigation. His security clearance was revoked. Multiple publications quietly revised their earlier coverage, removing language that had portrayed me as impulsive or unstable. Carson, for his part, said nothing. No rebuttal, no statement, just absence. It was the first time in his career that power had failed to shield him. It was also the first time I recognized that he didn't know who he was without it. Rumors circulated that his associates were creating distance, that his name was no longer being considered for a think tank appointment, that certain alliances, forged in private rooms and unspoken arrangements, were beginning to unravel. And I returned to Walter Reed. Same hallway, same rehabilitation wing, same faces. Only now something had shifted. When I entered the room, no one stood or saluted, but they watched. Not out of curiosity, out of recognition. Nathan was there, helping a younger patient adjust their leg brace. He smiled when he saw me. I nodded. In the far corner, Alexis was reviewing paperwork with a visiting therapist. She caught my eye and tilted her head. "Nice letter," she said. "Too long," I replied. She smirked. "No, just long enough." Later, walking past the windows that overlooked the rehabilitation garden, I reflected on the word everyone kept reaching for. Hero. I disliked it because heroes implied distance, perfection, elevation. That wasn't what I wanted. I wanted proximity, connection, ground-level change. I didn't want to be remembered for a headline. I wanted to be remembered for the silence I broke. One of the younger patients approached before I left that day. Barely 20 years old, still wearing his pain like armor. He looked at me awkwardly and said, "Ma'am, did it feel worth it, going up against someone that powerful?" I considered it. Then I answered, "It didn't feel like going up against anything. It felt like standing still while everything else tried to push me backward." He nodded slowly, as though he understood. Maybe he did. That evening, alone in my quarters, I received a final notification from the DOD's Office of Oversight. Carson Ward, pending full review, had been permanently removed from his advisory roles. His influence had been deemed incompatible with the ethical standards of military partnership. No ceremony, no dramatico lapse. Just a name subtracted. I closed the email, folded my uniform for the next morning, and wrote in my field notebook the only words that mattered now. I didn't raise my voice to be loud. I raised it to be clear. There's a particular kind of quiet that only exists in recovery rooms. Not the quiet of stillness, but of waiting for healing, waiting for strength, waiting to believe in either. That morning at Walter Reed, the quiet wasn't oppressive. It hummed, not like something absent, but something unfolding. Nathan was leading group mobility exercises in the East Rehabilitation Wing, a space of mats, braces, perspiration, and encouragement delivered in short, honest intervals. I stood at the back, arms folded, watching him, not as an officer, not even as a mentor, but as a witness to how far he had traveled. His walk wasn't flawless, still uneven in places, but it was proud, grounded by conviction rather than pity. He carried himself like someone who no longer feared falling. The group around him had evolved over the preceding weeks. Younger soldiers, some barely past their first tours. One wore a carbon fiber prosthetic leg. Another had undergone partial facial reconstruction. None of them resembled anyone's definition of ready. But they were. Not because they had fully healed, but because they had begun. Nathan noticed me watching and gave a subtle nod. Then he turned to his group and said something I hadn't anticipated. I took my first step because she didn't push me. He gestured in my direction. I knew she could have. She had the rank, the experience, the authority. But she didn't give me orders. She gave me space. That's what saved me. I hadn't been prepared for that. It's easier to wear armor when people challenge you. It's harder when they see you. He looked at a young private in the front row, a kid barely out of surgery a month prior, below the knee amputation on the left side. His expression held that familiar look I had encountered too many times, fear disguised as defiance. Nathan stepped toward him and smiled. "You up for something different today?" The kid hesitated. "Like what?" Nathan walked to a small speaker in the corner, tapped his phone, and a soft instrumental began to play. Slow, steady, just enough rhythm to suggest movement. Then Nathan extended his hand. No one spoke. The kid looked around, then down at his own leg. "Man, I can't dance." Nathan replied, "Neither could I." The kid blinked. Then, to everyone's surprise, he stood. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't quick, but it was his choice. Nathan didn't lead. He didn't direct. He mirrored, matched his pace, allowed the young man to falter, recover, and move again. I watched it unfold exactly as it had between Nathan and me weeks earlier. But this time, I wasn't part of it. I wasn't at the center. I wasn't the one reaching out. I was the one letting go. And that, I understood, was the point. Recovery isn't about returning to where you once were. It's about creating space for someone else to rise. When the music ended, Nathan and the kid exchanged a brief nod. No clapping, no applause, just a mutual understanding. One of the therapists leaned toward me and whispered, "He's really becoming something, isn't he?" I nodded. He already is. Later that day, I found Nathan near the courtyard benches, sipping water and adjusting his brace. "Wasn't expecting you to start a dance program," I said. He chuckled. "Wasn't planning on it, but works." I sat beside him. An autumn breeze moved through. The air carried the scent of dry leaves and eucalyptus. "Do you remember what you told me that first day?" I asked. He thought for a moment. "I remember you didn't tell me what to do." I smiled. "You said this one hurts. And I told you that meant it was working." He nodded, looking out at the garden. "Still true," he said. "Hurts less, though." We sat quietly for a while. Then he looked at me and asked, "Do you think I'm ready?" "For what?" "To do for someone else what you did for me." I met his eyes. "You already are." He looked down at his brace, adjusted the strap, then whispered almost to himself. "She didn't guide. She followed. But that's what made us move." I didn't reply. That line was no longer mine. It belonged to him now. He asked to meet at the old Overlook, the place where we used to ride bikes as children, where our father would take us after long church Sundays and teach us to skip rocks down into the canyon. I didn't reply to his text immediately. I wasn't certain I wanted to go, but I showed up, not out of obligation, not out of nostalgia, just for closure. Carson was already there when I arrived. He stood with his back to me, both hands resting on the railing as though trying to anchor himself. He didn't turn when I approached, didn't say hello. He simply stared out over the edge and said, "I used to think you'd always be behind me." I didn't respond. He continued, "You were the kid who colored inside the lines. The one who cried when mom forgot your birthday. You weren't supposed to outrank me. You weren't supposed to outshine." Finally, he turned. His face looked older than I remembered, or perhaps simply heavier. Carson had always carried our family's expectations like medals. Now they clattered like chains. "I thought if I cut you down early enough, you'd remain manageable," he admitted. His voice didn't waver. It wasn't a confession seeking absolution. It was an observation. "I didn't hate you," he added quickly. "I just didn't want you to prove that I wasn't special." I let the silence settle between us. Then I said, "You don't have to be special to be good." He scoffed. "Easy for you to say. You have medals, articles, letters from generals. Me? I'm the one under review." He turned back toward the distant trees. Then his voice dropped. "How did you survive it?" I blinked. "Survive what?" He didn't look at me when he asked. "How did you keep living knowing the family thought you were a burden?" The question struck harder than I'd expected. It wasn't delivered as an attack. It carried none of his habitual venom. It was raw and genuine. I breathed in, then said carefully, "I lived because I knew I didn't need anyone to lead me to stand." He didn't react at first. Then he leaned against the railing, looking downward as though hoping the ground might offer an answer. "I used to think control was strength," he said quietly. "But the truth is, I was afraid. If you succeeded without me, I had no excuse. I kept telling myself you were reckless, emotional, naive. But I read the reports. I saw what you did in Afghanistan, what you did for Nathan." He looked over at me, no apology in his eyes, but no fury either, just a man who had run out of illusions. "I thought leadership was about being followed," he said. "It's about stepping aside so others can move." I replied. A moment passed. Then he asked, "Do you hate me?" The wind shifted around us. I considered it honestly. The marks he had pressed into years of my life, both through words and the silences that followed them. The way he had recast my loyalty as threat. But I also thought of our father, of our childhood, of the hours spent building pillow forts and racing toward the ice cream truck. "I don't," I said, "but I'm no longer waiting for you to change either." That landed. He nodded once, not comprehension, perhaps, but something close to acceptance. "I'm leaving the advisory post," he said finally. "It's not official yet, but I don't belong there. Not anymore." I didn't offer congratulations or condolences. I simply stood beside him, one final moment of shared air. He pushed off the railing and brushed invisible dust from his coat. "Well," he muttered, I guess you turned out all right." Then he walked away. No embrace, no farewell, just footsteps dissolving into gravel. And for the first time in years, I didn't follow. I stayed. They had said the event would be modest, a closed military gathering, no cameras, no press. But when I arrived at the base auditorium that morning, I found rows of uniforms, rows of medals, rows of silence waiting to be filled. The hall smelled of polished wood and formal restraint. Every seat held someone who had fought, endured loss, bled, or guided another person back from the edge. Every face carried the weight of what it required to wear that uniform without being crushed beneath it. I hadn't worn my full dress blues since the day I was pinned colonel. But this time I stood differently. Not because of what they were about to present me, but because I had finally released the need for their permission to stand tall. General Beckett opened the ceremony. He looked older than the last time I'd seen him, but softer as well. "Today," he said, his voice steady, "we present the Dedicatus honor not merely for battlefield courage, but for a deeper form of valor. One that heals where others have destroyed. One that dares to restore what war has broken." I stood at attention, though inside I was holding my breath. He continued, "Colonel Penelope Ward did not simply save my son. She reminded an entire generation of warriors that recovery is not weakness. That the quiet work performed without cameras or headlines is sometimes the greatest service of all." His voice fractured ever so slightly. Then he nodded toward me. I stepped forward. The hall rose in a standing ovation. Not thunderous, not that kind of crowd, but deep and grounded, as though the air itself had grown heavier with meaning. He placed the medal around my neck. It was substantial. He leaned in and whispered, "This should have happened years ago. I'm sorry it didn't." I nodded. "It happened when it was needed most, sir." He smiled. The applause continued as I turned to face the room. I scanned the assembled faces. At the far end of the third row, I saw her, Nathan's mother, hands clasped tightly, a tear tracing her cheek, pride carved into her posture. And in the very last row, farthest back, no dress uniform, no name tag, just a man in a plain suit standing alone. Carson. His shoulders were stiff, his expression unreadable. No one around him acknowledged his presence. He merged into the wall like a misplaced memory, forgotten, irrelevant. But when our eyes met, he didn't look away. And for the first time, I saw water in his. Not the kind you hold back out of pride. The kind that comes when something within you fractures and you recognize that it needed to. He didn't nod. He didn't smile. But I saw it, the quiet truth behind his silence. He saw me now, not as the sister he had tried to diminish, but as the woman who had stood on her own. The woman who hadn't retaliated, but restored. As I descended from the stage, I passed the aisle where he stood. I didn't stop, but I slowed just for half a second. Long enough for him to understand that I saw him too. Not to forgive, not to forget, but to release. The metal pressed against my chest like a second heartbeat. And in that moment, I didn't feel victorious. I felt free. Not because justice had thundered through the halls, but because it had whispered where it mattered most. I was just about to leave the stage when a hand brushed my sleeve. I turned, and there was Nathan, still in uniform, still walking with a faint tremor in his left leg, but somehow taller, more composed, his shoulders carrying purpose rather than burden. "Colonel," he said, voice low enough that only I could hear. "Today, would you follow me?" I blinked. The room around us blurred for a moment, as though the question had rewound something deep inside me. The young man who had once sat silent in a wheelchair was now the one asking me to follow. I nodded once. "Always." Nathan took the lead. I didn't ask where we were going. I simply moved 2 steps behind him, the way I had once followed senior surgeons through war zone triage tents. He walked past the general, past his father, past Beckett's expression of surprise that slowly dissolved into quiet understanding. Nathan walked directly to the podium where I had just been decorated. He adjusted the microphone, then glanced back once to confirm I was still there. Then he began. "My name is Nathan Beckett," he said, his voice carrying a faint tremor. "And I want to say something, not as a soldier's son, but as a soldier still becoming. You could have heard a pin fall. I was broken when Colonel Ward found me. Not just my body, my belief, my will, my sense of matching." He looked out across the sea of uniformed faces, all waiting. She didn't repair me. She didn't push me. She didn't even ask me to stand. He paused. She danced with me. People shifted in their seats. She showed me that dignity isn't restored through pity or applause, but by being seen, treated not as what you've lost, but as what you still are. He turned his left and raised his hand. From the side aisle, a small group of soldiers began stepping forward, one by one. A young woman with a prosthetic arm, a former Marine with tremors, a quiet man whose gaze never quite settled. Each of them moved toward the stage, not marching, not saluting, simply arriving. They took the microphone one by one. I was ready to discharge myself. I didn't believe I deserved care. She sat beside me for 3 hours and said nothing. But she was there. I was ashamed to be seen in public. Colonel Ward told me, "You earned every scar. Wear it like a story worth telling." I've never worn long sleeves since. My mother said I should stop calling myself a soldier. The colonel said, "You still are. You always will be." Their words didn't shake the walls. They shook something else, quiet and enduring, like soil being turned gently, finally prepared for new growth. I stood there as they spoke, but I didn't move forward. This was not my moment. It was theirs. Every voice, every wound, every halting breath bore witness to something I had almost forgotten myself. That leadership isn't about commanding. It's about witnessing someone into becoming who they already were. After the final soldier spoke, Nathan turned to me again. No ceremony, no microphone, just that simple expression of reverence. "Colonel Ward," he said, "thank you for not rescuing us." I tilted my head slightly. He smiled. "You let us rescue ourselves." My throat tightened. He extended his hand once more, not as a wounded son, not as a recovering patient, but as an equal. I stepped forward and took it. We didn't bow. We didn't salute. We stood side by side, surrounded by stories that needed no headlines to carry weight. Then from the rear of the room, someone began to clap. Slow, measured, deliberate. It built, not into thunder, but into harmony. The kind of applause reserved for the end of something not flashy, but true. I said nothing more. I simply looked at Nathan, then at the others on stage, and whispered, "Thank you for letting me follow." Because sometimes real leaders don't lead. They step aside and trust that those they once lifted can carry the torch forward, burning even brighter. There was no stage this time, no polished podium, no press presence, no anthem. Only a small clearing behind the rehabilitation center, lit by lanterns strung between oak trees. The light was soft and deliberately imperfect, like a memory you want to hold slightly blurred, one that feels like it belongs to everyone. We called a movement gathering, not a ceremony, not a therapy session, just a dance. The music wasn't formal, no military processional, no ballroom orchestra, just a playlist of old vinyl recordings and acoustic covers playing from a cracked speaker someone had taped to a wheelchair handle. But the rhythm pulsed through us. Not loudly, just enough to be felt. Nathan was there, naturally. He wore a tie that matched nothing and boots polished as though he still believed medals mattered. He didn't speak much. He didn't need to. Neither did I. We didn't lead the dancing. That wasn't the point. Some soldiers stepped forward hesitantly. Some wheeled themselves to the center and simply swayed. Others held on to partners and moved inches at a time. Every movement was sufficient. Every inch was meaningful. Across from me, a young private with 2 prosthetic legs guided her mother in a slow, rotating shuffle. The mother wept throughout, not from grief, but because she was finally watching her daughter move without needing to prove anything. Behind them, 2 veterans bumped shoulders, laughing as they stumbled over choreography that clearly didn't exist. To my left, one of the older nurses tapped a beat on her cane, teaching a rhythm no one had asked to learn, but everyone tried to follow anyway. It was ungainly. It was beautiful. Then I saw him, standing just beyond the circle of lights. Carson, not in uniform. He hadn't stepped inside. He stood motionless, hands buried in his coat pockets, eyes scanning the crowd as though searching for someone to blame, and finding only people who were healing. He didn't come closer. He simply watched. We caught each other's gaze for a moment. I held it. There was no coldness left in me. Not tonight. I didn't wave. I didn't walk toward him. And I didn't need to, because for once I knew with certainty that I owed him nothing. Not rage, not grace. Just the space to witness something he could have been part of, but had chosen otherwise. He turned away before the final chorus. This time, I didn't feel hollow watching him go. I turned back to the dancing. Someone had started a new song that made no sense to waltz to, but that stopped no one. A man with burn scars across half his face twirled a medic who had once carried a stretcher. She cried out as he spun too fast, but he caught her wrist in time. Someone dropped their cane mid-step. A young soldier caught it mid-air and grinned like he had just saved a life. Perhaps he had. No applause, just rhythm, just us. And somewhere inside that barely lit clearing, the past loosened its grip. I stepped into the center, where no one looked at me as a colonel or a sister or a daughter who had brought embarrassment to the family name. They looked at me simply as someone who had dared to dance first. Nathan moved beside me, leaning close. "Colonel," he said softly, smiling. I raised a brow. "Tonight," he whispered, "we dance for you." But I shook my head. "No," I said gently. "Tonight, we dance for us." He nodded, and I let myself be drawn into the rhythm once more. Not because I needed to be seen, but because I had nothing left to prove. The stars blinked through the branches overhead. For a moment, the war in my bones grew quiet. This wasn't revenge. This was release. This was what healing looked like. Awkward, unscripted, courageous, and deeply, profoundly human. I used to walk behind people. Not out of fear, not out of weakness, but because that's what I was taught. That support personnel stay in the background, behind the glory, behind the ranks. Even after I earned my commission, even wearing this uniform, they still said it, sometimes cruelly, sometimes gently. "You're still just a nurse." But here's what they didn't understand. I never needed to be led. Not then, not now. I learned that truth one step at a time. In triage tents, soaked with sweat and silence. When no orders came, an instinct preserved lives. On the day, I asked a wounded soldier to dance. Not because he was ready, but because he deserved to feel seen. On every day, I kept moving forward while my brother tried to erase me from the story simply because I didn't fit the version of a soldier he wished to be associated with. I used to believe that being dismissed by your own family was the deepest wound. It wasn't. The real pain was pretending it didn't matter. So I stopped pretending. I stopped waiting for someone to guide me out of the shadows they had constructed. And by walking forward on my own, quietly, without spectacle, I didn't only lead others. I led myself out from beneath their narrow gaze. Tonight, under these paper lanterns and bare trees, surrounded by those brave enough to move on trembling limbs and mended hearts, I finally see it clearly. Every step we take, no matter how unsteady, is a kind of story. Mine is not about medals, defiance, or vengeance. It is about becoming. It is about returning to myself. And wherever you are, whatever your scars or silences, I hope you know that it's possible for you as well. Before I say goodbye, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Is it a quiet morning with a warm cup of coffee, or a late night when stories like this keep you company? Let me know in the comments. I read every one with gratitude. And if this story moved you, please consider subscribing to the channel. Not only to hear more stories like mine, but to become part of a community that still believes in kindness, healing, and second chances. Thank you for spending this time with me today. Wherever you are, I hope you carry this story with you. And remember, sometimes the miracle doesn't knock on your door. It waits quietly until you're ready to open your heart. Take care. I'm Colonel Penelope Ward, and I finally know who I am. We'll see each other in the next story. Until then, keep dancing.